Our Old Testament text and our sermon for this morning will come from Song of Solomon, chapter 7. We'll read and preach the whole chapter this morning. Found on page 676 in your Geneva Bible. 676. The Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verses 1 to 13. Next week we will finish our study of the Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon, chapter 7, page 676. Verse 1. How beautiful are thy goings with shoes, O prince's daughter! The joints of thy thighs are like jewels, the work of the hand of a cunning workman. Thy navel is as a round cup that wanteth not liquor, thy belly as an heap of wheat compassed about with lilies. Thy two breasts are as two young roes that are twins. Thy neck is like a tower of ivory. Thine eyes are like the fish pools in Heshbon by the gate of Bath Rabbim. Thy nose is as the tower of Lebanon that looketh toward Damascus. Thine head upon thee is as scarlet, and the bush of thine head like purple. The king is tied in the rafters. How fair art thou, and how pleasant art thou, O my love in pleasures! This thy stature is like a palm tree, and thy breasts like clusters. I said, I will go up into the palm tree. I will take hold of her boughs. Thy breasts shall now be like the clusters of the vine, and the savor of thy nose like apples, and the roof of thy mouth like good wine, which goeth straight to my well-beloved, and causeth the lips of the ancient to speak. I am my well-beloved's, and his desire is toward me. Come, my well-beloved, let us go forth into the field. Let us remain in the villages. Let us get up early to the vines. Let us see if the vine flourish, whether it hath budded the small grape, or whether the pomegranates flourish. There will I give thee my love. The mandrakes have given a smell, and in our gates are all sweet things, new and old. My well-beloved, I have kept them for thee. The title of our message this morning, Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verses 1 to 13, The Presence of Christ and Sanctification. The Presence of Christ and Sanctification. Our brief beginning. Beginning last week at chapter 6, verse 4, Christ has been praising the bride. This praise continues in this morning's text until we get to the 10th verse of chapter 7, at which point the bride will respond to all this great praise by Christ in verses 10 through 13. There are 3 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 5, Christ praises 10 characteristics of the bride. Then verses 6 through 9, the beneficial effects of Christ's near presence upon the bride. And then in verses 10 to 13, the bride speaks. The bride responds and desires Christ in all parts of the day. And now our context. In a previous sermon in chapter 5, verses 10 through 16, the bride had praised Christ by 10 characteristics. Now Christ returns the compliment and also praises 10 characteristics of the bride, here in this morning's text, verses 1 to 5. With the presence of Christ returned, the bride advances in grace and works, for she is so encouraged by the nearness of Christ. She aims to please him so that his presence will remain. We'll see that in verses 6 through 9. And then the bride, having the near presence of Christ, is anxious to please Christ and maintain her comfortable position. Verses 10 through 13. Beginning with verse 1. Christ is speaking. He continues to speak well of the bride here. How beautiful are thy goings with shoes, O prince's daughter! The joints of thy thighs are like jewels, the work of the hand of a cunning workman. Christ now proceeds to praise 10 characteristics of the bride. The characteristics represent his emotions toward all believers at all times. Christ begins at the feet and makes his way up to the head. The first characteristic of the bride praised by Christ is her feet. He says, how beautiful are thy goings with shoes. The physical feet throughout Scriptures represent the spiritual walk of the believer, as in Psalm 119:105, which encourages us to use the Scriptures as a lamp unto our feet, to guide our feet. We notice that the feet in this text have shoes. They are not bare feet. Bare feet in the scriptures implies either a shameful condition, as in Isaiah 20, verse 4, or a sad affliction, as in 2 Samuel 15:30, or a lack of readiness, as in Exodus 12:11. Therefore, feet covered with shoes show forth a thriving spiritual condition in which one's shame is covered. Ephesians 6:15 furthermore requires us to have our feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. A holy walk, here praised by Christ of the bride, is beautiful to Christ. We notice also that Christ calls his bride, O Prince's daughter, which is well attributed to the elect of God, because there is a nobility and greatness to believers by adoption, having been elected to be of royal descent, 1 Peter 2:9. We are the sons and daughters to the Lord God Almighty, 2 Corinthians 6:18. And we are called the daughters to the King of Kings, daughter to the King of Kings, in Revelations 21:7. So she is called the Prince's daughter, because we are of nobility. The second characteristic of the bride, spoken by Christ, is the joints of thy thighs are like jewels. This refers to the manner in which these holy acts performed by her feet are performed. While the actual feet perform the act of walking, it is the intricate design of the thigh joints which make the feet to walk properly. So the joints of the thigh refer to the manner in which we order our lives for success, such as regularly reading the scriptures, private and family worship, as well as attendance to the public ordinances. A person who is physically lame cannot walk well, and a person spiritually lame does not spiritually conduct themselves well. A well-ordered life is the equivalent of a well-placed jewel by a cunning workman, we're told. Verse 2, Thy navel is as a round cup that wanteth not liquor. Thy belly is an heap of wheat compassed about with lilies. The third characteristic praised is the navel, working its way up from the feet to the top of the head. The navel has a unique meaning throughout the scriptures. When one is healthy, one is said to have a healthy navel, such as is found in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, where it says, Be not wise in thine own eyes, but fear the Lord and depart from evil. So health shall be unto thy navel. The navel's physical usefulness is found in its attachment to the umbilical cord of a child. This cord provides health to the baby from the mother. In the same manner, a useful church or church member is health to those who are spiritually sick. The cord is the source of fluids or liquor for a child, and a healthy navel provides water to create a healthy child. Similarly, a healthy spiritual walk is not starved of living water. This simply refers to our spiritual walk being healthy. The fourth characteristic, the belly, continues in the metaphor of a pregnant woman. As the navel is for supplying the child with nourishment, so the belly, which grows large in pregnancy, is likened to an heap of wheat, for the manner in which it bulges. As a fertile woman brings forth a child, fertile valleys bring forth lilies. That's the comparison here. Christ here praises the fertile heart which brings forth good works in abundance, like a pregnant woman brings forth children, or a valley brings forth many lilies. The sense of this verse is that the church has a lovely spiritual constitution by the inward work of the Spirit, wherein we are not barren of fruit bearing, but well-watered, liquored here called, and pregnant with good works. Verse 3. Thy two breasts are as two young roes that are twins. The bride is now commended in this fifth characteristic for her nourishment towards the church. As a young mother nourishes her child with milk, so also the church nourishes its young by baptism, catechizing, and by teaching correct doctrine and worship. This nourishment helps its young to spiritually grow. As the young mother nourishes her child to bring them up to adult health, so the church brings its young to spiritual maturity. Verse 4. Thy neck is like a tower of ivory. Thine eyes are like the fish pools in Heshbon by the gate of Bath-rabbim. Thy nose is as the tower of Lebanon that looketh towards Damascus. In this verse we have the 6th, 7th, and 8th characteristics, which are the neck, the eyes, and the nose. The neck, it begins with, is described as like a tower of ivory. The neck is responsible for posture and determines the demeanor of a person. We've seen this before in another text. A drooping neck signifies sadness, and a stiff neck stands for stubbornness. Here the church is praised because its neck is neither proud nor drooping. It is tall, like an ivory tower. It has no need to hang, for her bridegroom has given her nothing but joy. And it has no need to be proud, for she knows that she is nothing without Christ. Continually moving up past the neck to the eyes. The eyes are compared to fish pools in Heshbon. This city, Heshbon, was the capital of Sihon, king of the Amorites. It was famous for its clear fish ponds which sat by the gate of Bath Rabbim. The eyes of the church are likewise praised for being clear and therefore possessing spiritual sight, meaning an ability to understand spiritual things. The nose is also compared to a tower. Thy nose is as the tower of Lebanon that looketh toward Damascus. This particular tower was in Lebanon and was built by Solomon as a lookout, the one that faced towards Damascus. It particularly had watchmen to guard against attacks from Damascus, which was at the time a fierce and wicked enemy. In the same manner, the nose is an instrument for smelling and discerning between what is pleasant and what is loathsome. The idea here is that as a nose can discern between good and bad smells, the believer can discern between good and evil. And finally, our last two characteristics. Verse 5, Thine head upon thee is as scarlet, and the bush of thine head like purple. The king is tied in the rafters. As the first characteristic started at the feet and moved up the body, we come to the last two characteristics, which are the head and the hair. The head is the seat of knowledge and understanding. It is where resides the mind, used to determine what is helpful and what is hurtful. Christ is known to us in the mind, and this is where our hope in Him resides. The head is the color here of scarlet, which in all of Scriptures pictures the shed blood of Christ. And so her head is adorned with the grace purchased by Christ. The final characteristic is her hair. A person's hair is what adorns a person to make them appear attractive. The bride's hair is said to be beautiful because it represents the beauty of her works of grace. And then it says that Christ is so ravished by the beauty of the church. It says the king is tied in the rafters. Christ is so ravished by the beauty of the church and so compelled to stay near her, it is as if he were a king tied in the rafters. In summary of these 10 works, because I know they came very quickly to you, just to give you an overall picture of what all these works amount to. The church here is being praised for 10 things. First, she's praised for her spiritual walk. Secondly, for the ordering of her life. Third, for her healthy spiritual life. For being pregnant with good works. Fifth, for nourishing the young. Sixth, for her Christian demeanor. 7, for her clear spiritual sight. 8, for discerning between good and evil. 9, for having a mind inclined to the things of God. And lastly, 10, for adorning herself with beautiful works of grace. We come to our second point, verses 6 to 9, the beneficial effects of Christ's near presence upon the bride. Verse 6, Christ continues to be the speaker here. How fair art thou, and how pleasant art thou, O my love, in pleasures. As the bridegroom would praise the physical loveliness of his bride, so Christ praises his bride spiritually. As brides are said to be fair physically on the day of their wedding, Christ asks, How fair art thou, and how pleasant art thou? Christ refers here to the grace that is within believers, making them fair to look upon. And the effect of this inward beauty is pleasant outward works of grace. Christ then calls her, O my love, in pleasures. Christ goes beyond calling his church just lovely, describing her as just lovely, but calls her love itself. Of all the objects in the world that man may regard as lovely to look upon, Christ says that there is nothing so lovely in all the world as grace and the actions that flow from grace in a believer. Verse 7, Christ continues to compliment the bride. This thy stature is like a palm tree, and thy breasts like clusters. Christ begins by comparing the bride's stature, or what we might say moral development, to a palm tree. A palm tree is straight, not crooked. It is upright, and it contains good fruits, which are dates. It is a tree that lives long and stays green and lively year-round. Psalm 92:14 makes the same comparison to believers in the palm tree when it says, "But like the palm tree flourishing," that should be, "shall be the righteous one." Palms are also a symbol of joy, such as when palm branches were thrown before Christ when he rode into Jerusalem, or in Revelation 7:4 when the victorious saints are said to have palms in their hands. And in the same manner, we are a joy to Christ. The second part of the bride's moral development is compared to breasts like clusters. As all men and women are said to have a bosom with which we embrace those we love, so this moral quality is a sign of love and affection towards Christ. So she is regarded in these two comparisons here for being upright in her conduct and loving and affectionate toward Christ. Verses 8 and 9 goes on to explain more of these two. I said, I will go up into the palm tree. I will take hold of her boughs. Thy breast shall now be like the clusters of the vine, and the savor of thy nose like apples, and the roof of thy mouth like good wine, which goeth down sweetly, and causeth the lips of the ancient to speak. Here in verses 8 and 9, the comparison of the church to a palm tree and a bosom is further elaborated upon. Here Christ shows how he will manifest himself unto the bride. Christ says, I will go up into the palm tree. I will take hold of her boughs. Boughs are, of course, branches. As a bridegroom would take his bride in an embrace by the arm, so Christ will spiritually embrace us by manifesting his presence to us to a larger degree. The effect of his taking hold of his church by his presence is that thy breast shall now be like the clusters of the vine. Christ says that when he comes to her, his bride, the church, by his very presence an accelerated grace will flow. And from that grace, others and Christ will be edified as if her graces were a cluster of grapes to refresh others. Christ's near presence here creates greater fruit bearing, clusters of grapes. And Christ will delight and feed upon these graces. Christ's pleasure in observing our graces is described here through the senses of smell and taste. Just as the sweet smell of apples to the nose, here in the text it says, and the savor of thy nose like apples, our fruit bearing, as a result of Christ's near presence, will be pleasant to the smell of Christ. Our good works delight Christ as smelling sweet and fresh, like an apple. Another effect of Christ's near presence is described in terms of taste. Our good works are to Christ like, quote, the roof of thy mouth filled with good wine. The righteous actions of believers are here compared to good wine. This fruit bearing is as delightful to Christ as the taste of the best wines going down the throat sweetly. The good works of believers here compared to the best of wines is so delightful to Christ it is said to revive the near dead. The works of believers, we're told, causeth the lips of the ancients to speak. These good works are like good wine, and so powerful that it makes men that are old, infirmed, and almost dead to revive and speak. The power of her good works is pictured here as able to revive others from spiritual drowsiness. It can quicken them and make them cheerful. And finally, we come to our last point, verses 10 to 13. The bride responds and desires Christ in all parts of the day. She says, this is the bride speaking now, I am my well-beloved's, and his desire is towards me. Up to this point, the bride has long been silent. delighted and receiving compliments from her bridegroom. Christ has been very generous in complimenting his bride, and she immediately responds to his love by equaling his interest and putting away all doubt that their separation has changed her status as the fortunate bride to Christ. She speaks plainly, "I am my well-beloved's," making it clear that she belongs to Christ and none other. In the last part of this verse, "and his desire is toward me," she shows the great privilege of belonging to one who desires to have us as his bride. Although she has mistreated him, leaving him out in the cold, abusing his kindness, and at times loving the world more than Christ, yet his desire is still towards us. The phrase is taken from Genesis 3, when God proclaimed to Eve that thy desire shall be towards him. As Eve became subordinate to Adam and conformed to his will so that she may please him, likewise the bride is subordinate to Christ, conforming ourselves to his will that we may please him. The bride continues, verse 11, "Come, my well-beloved, let us go forth into the field. Let us remain in the villages." Now that the bride is in the comfortable presence of Christ, she seeks to improve her state and jealously keep his presence. She begs Christ to come, pressing Christ for a greater degree of communion and nearness with her. Communion with Christ on earth is never complete and never satisfied until it is, of course, perfected in heaven. On earth, communion with Christ is work and requires the constant ordering of our lives so that we are in constant communion with Christ. She says to Christ, "Let us go," for she never again desires to be alone. The soul will be content to leave all things behind and dwell only in the presence of Christ. The bride, for whatever reason, is compelled to go to the field, possibly to work. But she will not go alone, but compels Christ to accompany her wherever she goes. She is resolved to bring Christ into all her worldly endeavors. She suggests further to Christ, "Let us remain in the villages." Villages are rural, distinguished from towns or cities. Men at the end of a busy day of working in the towns or cities retire for the evening to the villages for sleep. She not only wants to be accompanied during her time of work during the day, or for a small piece of the day, but to have him return with her in the night to an uninterrupted fellowship. The bride goes on, "Let us get up early to the vines. Let us see if the vine flourish, whether it hath budded the small grape, or whether the pomegranates flourish. There will I give thee my love." In the previous verse, verse 11, the bride awoke in the presence of Christ. She then desired him to accompany her into the field during the day, and then to continue to dwell with her in the evening. Here in verse 12, it is now the following morning, and the bride still fervently desires the presence of Christ to remain with her. She suggests to the bridegroom, "Let us get up early to the vines." Whenever Scriptures speak of doing something early, it suggests a great desire, eagerness, or zeal to perform some action, such as when the women came to Christ's grave early in the morning. She rises early because she has a sincere desire to fellowship with Christ that is even more important to her than sleeping in. She suggests to Christ, "Let us see if the vine flourish, whether it hath budded the small grape, or whether the pomegranates flourish." The vine, the grape, and the pomegranate all stand for the same thing, her duties towards the grace that she has been given. She knows that with the presence of Christ near, she is capable of accelerated grace and sanctification. With Christ present, she desires to see if her vine flourishes, referring to specific acts of reform and advancement. She will examine all her actions with Christ, whether there are new improvements, as is in the phrase, "whether the small grape has budded," and search in areas where she has already shown maturity, such as whether the pomegranates flourish. No detail of her life is too big or too small to not warrant self-examination for the sake of maintaining the presence of Christ. And finally in verse 13, the mandrakes have given a smell, and in our gates are all sweet things new and old. My well-beloved, I have kept them for thee. The sanctifying graces that are the result of Christ's near presence are summarized as the mandrake fruit, which gives off a pleasant smell. The bride has produced righteous works as a gardener produces fruit. As the gardener lays the fruit by the gate for sale, the sanctified believer lays her works before Christ for his delight. The works here are called sweet things, for the graces of a believer are many and vary. And they are called here new and old, for we are called to maintain our old progressions, but also to add new progressions. Lastly, she says, I have kept them for thee, for although others benefit by our good works, they are ultimately done for Christ, so that he may take pleasure in us. 7th chapter of the Song of Solomon. Let us conclude our worship with the singing of our third psalm, Psalm 85, verses 6 through 13. To the tune of Naomi. Psalm 85, verses 6 to 13, to the tune of Naomi.
That
in thee may thy people joy, wilt thou at last revive. Show us thy mercy, Lord, to us, do thy salvation give. Hear what God the Lord will speak. To his folk he'll speak peace, and to his saints, but let them not return to foolishness. To them that fear him, surely near is his salvation. That glory in our land may have her habitation. Truth met with mercy, righteousness, and peace kissed mutually. Truth springs from earth, and righteousness looks down from heaven high. Yea, what is good the Lord shall give, our land shall yield increase. Justice to set us in his steps shall go before his face. Now let us hear the benediction. May the Lord bless thee and keep thee. May the Lord make his face to shine upon thee and give thee peace. Amen.